Madam Chair, distinguished delegates, more than 3 years after the Taliban seized power, my report traverses a range of very serious human rights violations perpetrated against many sectors of Afghan society, foremost among them women and girls. This may come as no surprise to delegates here, but the grim situation should not lead us to despair or complacency. Rather, it demands urgent attention and should galvanise this Assembly, other intergovernmental and regional bodies, and individual states into taking decisive action. Some positive developments asserted by the Taliban in areas such as security, anti-corruption, and counter-narcotics, which have led to improvements in humanitarian and other access, especially to remote areas, are regrettably seriously undermined by their rejection of or withdrawal from the state's human rights obligations and its cooperation with my mandate. I've noted a more aggressive tone this year. For example, instead of promising that schools for girls will reopen after a period of review, the de facto authorities now state that this and other matters relating to human rights are an internal matter. My report details the Taliban's systematic gender oppression amounting to gender persecution, and which is described as gender apartheid by many Afghans. The new so-called vice and virtue law institutionalizes an expanding list of restrictions that blatantly violate the rights of women and girls. It also impacts the entire society, including men, religious minorities, and journalists, as it infringes on their cultural rights, religious freedoms, and freedom of expression. Women are literally silenced, and they're being seen as a threat to the Taliban's vision and strategy. I've also documented shrinking civic space, pressure on minorities, and ongoing threats, torture, and extrajudicial killings of former government and security personnel, protesters, judges, and lawyers, as well as corporal punishments and credible allegations of sexual violence during detention. Economic and social rights are unfulfilled due to chronic underfunding amid a humanitarian crisis, with more than half the population requiring humanitarian assistance, exacerbated by Taliban's policies. Justice, equality, and the rule of law are being systematically disregarded. Those most vulnerable, children, widows, persons with disabilities, LGBTI persons, and those facing intersecting forms of discrimination are disproportionately affected. I'm deeply concerned about the plight of ethnic and religious minorities, particularly the Hazara community, who continue to be violently targeted, especially by Daesh, and further experience discrimination and sidelining by the de facto authorities in many aspects of their lives. Many of them are Shia Muslims who are unjustifiably restricted in freely manifesting their own religion, including during the month of Muharram. There is an urgent need for accountability and effective protection measures. The space for freedoms of expression, association, and peaceful assembly has diminished significantly. Human rights defenders, especially women, journalists, and civil society members face threats, intimidation, and harassment. Some of those detained report serious ill treatment. Local organizations encounter bureaucratic hurdles and censorship from the de facto authorities. Madam Chair, how can this human rights situation be improved? The international community needs a unified approach. It should devise, adopt, and implement a comprehensive, coordinated, human rights-centered action plan. Right here in New York, member states, supported by the UN Secretariat, should also leverage the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Last November's independent assessment on Afghanistan and the authority of both the Security Council and the General Assembly that will have a resolution on Afghanistan during the current session. The lack of a strong, united response from the international community has already emboldened the Taliban. Within a month of participating in the third Doha meeting, they introduced the so-called morality law, not only further restricting virtually every aspect of women's lives, but also placing restrictions on the practices of religious minorities and curtailing the media. For over 3 years, women and girls have been barred from secondary school and beyond. There are increasing concerns that the Taliban are introducing more fundamentalist madrasas to eventually replace public schools, threatening to further limit educational opportunities and promoting a narrow and possibly extremist ideology. This shift poses significant risks to the future of Afghan youth and the overall stability of the country, with a potential global impact. I meet Afghan youth regularly, including last week, as they represent the majority of the country's population, and they're the future. They're talented and inspiring. However, they're leaving the country reluctantly, as they see little hope to fill their life potential there. How can they be given hope? And what are the implications for girls and boys who grow up in a society that dehumanizes women and girls? Madam Vice Chair, what more needs doing? I advocate for an all-tools approach rooted in human rights, which includes making it clear to the Taliban that demonstrable improvements in human rights is a prerequisite for any normalization, ensuring survivor-centered pathways to justice and accountability through existing mechanisms in The Hague and Geneva, and also leveraging New York-based ones, codifying gender apartheid as a crime against humanity, noting that the first step is to ensure that a treaty as a whole is agreed on, ensuring the meaningful inclusion of Afghan voices, especially women's voices, in political processes and diplomatic engagements, reinforcing and funding Afghan women and girls, human rights defenders, marginalized communities and organizations, and finally, keeping Afghanistan firmly on the international agenda. These are urgent and practical steps to support the people of Afghanistan. We must send a clear message to the Taliban. There will be consequences for violations of human rights. We need to demonstrate to Afghans that the international community stands with them, not just in words, but through decisive actions. The Afghan people are displaying remarkable courage and resilience. I've spoken with young women defying the Taliban to pursue education, journalists risking their lives to report on human rights violations, female lawyers preparing defense cases, and humanitarian workers tirelessly providing assistance. Their bravery and determination must be matched by our unwavering support and solidarity. I look forward to your questions and your continuing support. Thank you.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, at the outset, we would like to extend our sincere gratitude to Special Rapporteur Mr. Bennett for his diligent work in documenting Afghanistan's human rights crisis, and for his dedication and his principled position in supporting human rights and documenting and reporting the violations. We commend the extension of your mandate and support your vital contributions, despite the Taliban's travel ban on your access to Afghanistan. Your report offers a sobering and critical account of life for millions of Afghans under a regime that disregards fundamental rights, subverts justice, and silences dissent. Mr. Bennett's report highlights the harrowing reality of Afghan women and girls, now enduring unprecedented institutionalized oppression and discrimination. Since the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan in August 2021, strict policies have dismantled fundamental rights and freedoms across the country. While Afghanistan was once on a path towards progress, it now suffers under policies that severely impact all Afghans, especially women, ethnic minorities, former government officials, and those associated with prior security forces. In particular, the newly enacted so-called law of the promotion of virtue and prevention of vice has placed severe constraints on both the public and private lives of Afghans, focusing compliance with rigid interpretation that stifle personal freedoms and restrict nearly all aspects of life. The Taliban has proven unwilling to heed the legitimate demands of Afghans and international community for an inclusive, accountable government that reflects the will of the people and includes meaningful participation from all sectors of society, especially women. Despite repeated calls, the Taliban has ignored efforts to establish a government that represents Afghanistan's diverse voices and instead imposed a rule that prioritized exclusion over unity. Afghan women and girls are disproportionately impacted by the Taliban's oppressive policies. Girls are barred from secondary school and universities, while women face severe restrictions, denying them access to most professions and public spaces without a male guardian. This systematic gender apartheid robs Afghan society of half of its potential and pushes it into a regressive state, undermining both social progress and national development. Beyond gender, ethnic and religious minorities, including the Hazara community, face persecution, discrimination, and targeted violence. Mosques, schools, and other public spaces have been attacked with little to no protection from authorities. One of the most alarming issues is the Taliban's retaliation against former security personnel and government officials. Despite promises of amnesty, reports of arbitrary detention, torture, forced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings persist, creating a climate of terror. Families live in constant fear as their loved ones who once served Afghanistan face retribution for their past affiliations. This pattern of unchecked power and impunity represents a stark violation of Afghanistan's human rights commitments. These are crimes against humanity. The freedoms Afghans once held, including freedom of expression, have been stifled by the Taliban restrictions. Independent journalists face harassment, detention, and violence, making Afghanistan one of the most dangerous places for press freedom today. Under the Taliban rule, Afghanistan's economy has plunged into crisis with rising unemployment and poverty. Economic desperation and lack of basic resources have forced countless Afghans to flee, seeking safety and stability abroad. The Taliban's policies do not reflect true Islamic values or Afghan traditions. These policies deepen Afghanistan's cycle of poverty, dependence, and conflict, undermining its path to self-reliance and lasting peace. We call on the Taliban. Afghan people have suffered for 4 decades. Enough is enough. It is time to listen to their legitimate demands and serve them, not oppress them. We fully support the recommendations outlined in the Special Rapporteur's report, in addition to the call for recognition of gender apartheid in Afghanistan. And also we call for the establishment of an independent accountability mechanism for Afghanistan, complementary to the Special Rapporteur's work. We also highlight the importance of accountability, and in this regard we welcome the initiative launched by Germany, Canada, Australia, and the Netherlands, supported by 22 other states, to hold the Taliban accountable for violations of its obligations under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. This initiative, which could be brought before the International Court of Justice, underscores the global commitment to holding the Taliban accountable for their human rights abuses. The international community must adopt a unified, rights-based approach to Afghanistan, integrating these recommendations into all discussions, including the Doha process. We urge the principled stance in engagement, requiring measurable human rights improvements as preconditions for any dialogue with the Taliban. This approach will reinforce accountability and keep human rights at the front of diplomatic efforts. Today, the Afghan people face dark reality where freedom, dignity, and security are swiftly eroding. The international community cannot remain passive. We must demand accountability, support Afghan people, and advance and advocate for their future, where the rights of all Afghans, particularly women, minorities, and vulnerable, are protected. Afghanistan's future hangs in the balance, and time is of essence.